interaction with my colleagues, on teachings, on leadership and so on, how I've sort of come to use this term as a layman. And probably as a person, an Asian who has been, I wouldn't say I'm a practicing Buddhist, but as someone who's been brought up within Buddhist literature and Buddhist traditions, how the concept of mindfulness in Buddhism has sort of affected why I use the term and why I use it in what I do. And that's about all I can share with you. My interest in this whole topic of mindfulness, particularly in leadership, I think originates from three different directions. The first one is that I find it particularly interesting to talk about leadership with young people rather than with cynical old CEOs. So I don't spend much time with that. Instead, I spend it with young people. In fact, I just came back from a conference at West Point where we engaged with young cadets and other students, and I talked about mindfulness and leadership and found that it resonated with them. I also do quite a number of leadership sessions with my own colleagues in the Voluntary Management Academy, people in their late 20s, early 30s, and it's in the attempt to try to talk about leadership with people who are not presidents, scholars, and future ministers, but people who are just going to be leaders in their own little small worlds. I've been challenged to try to find ways to talk about leadership which is meaningful to them. And that's one approach from which I've found mindfulness, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on, interesting. The second thing is that I've always found it interesting to the extent that being chairman of SMU, I'm supposed to be a little bit knowledgeable about academic literature. And I find that the literature on leadership, as practiced in business schools, is very much influenced by Western sort of social, cultural, ethical traditions. And I think in my own engaging with young Asians, I found that if you go from that angle, much of it, the alpha male kind of syndrome, the aggressive, assertive, individualistic style of leader, doesn't really resonate with a lot of young Asians, who are by instinct perhaps less assertive, more sort of collectivist, and more perhaps internally contemplative. So how do I find a way to approach leadership training which is more consonant with perhaps Asian social cultural traditions? And that's where I found also the concept of mindfulness, a more contemplative approach to leadership as opposed to a relatively more assertive Western style approach to leadership. How perhaps that might allow Asians to not only evolve their own form of leadership, but to perhaps also make a contribution to the entire global literature on leadership, to the extent that mindfulness as a concept has basically originated from Eastern sort of philosophical traditions. And finally, my interest in mindfulness and leadership originates, I think, out of my own views about what are the fundamental attributes of leadership, that in fact, leadership originates not from action, but from your mind and from what you think about. So with those three bases, let me first talk about the first approach, that is, how do you engage people who are in their 20s, who are not going to be future presidents and generals and so on, but who are just hopefully going to be leaders in their own little small worlds? How do you talk to them about leadership? And my starting point with young people who've never really experienced high levels of leadership is that leadership is all about making difficult decisions. And the biggest obstacle to making a difficult decision, whether it be a huge one or a small one, is the person looking at yourself in the mirror. In other words, my major point to most young people is that it is your own self, it's your ego, your emotions, that is the biggest obstacle to making a good decision. And that if you are able to remove your own self out of the equation, very often the right answer is staring at you in the face. That's when the whole concept of mindfulness comes into play. And when I was at West Point recently, talking to a group of 10 people that I had to stay with for the whole day, the first point in talking about leadership was, and these are only people in their 20s, so I asked them, can you think of the most difficult decision you've ever had to make, which was against your own personal inclinations, but which you made because you knew it was ultimately the right thing to do because you took yourself out of it? And I related to them my own incident, which I think was my first example of mindfulness, and to the extent that I can remember it so vividly today, even though it was 40 years ago. I think indicates to me how strong that memory and that experience was. And this was when I was just 20, and I was thrown out of Stanford University, and I was accepted immediately to go to Cornell, and I spent probably about one whole day away from everybody, and I was walking around Lake Lagunita, and essentially that was my first dilemma as a young person of how to take myself out of the equation and in order to make a right decision. And the sensation of making that decision I recall so well. It was my first experience, I think, of mindfulness, to the extent that it was a certain amount of self-detachment. I could even see myself looking down on myself, almost like with a third eye, and seeing myself making a decision where I took my ego out of it, and my emotions and everything else. And subsequently, it has become easier to make decisions, because every time I encounter a difficult decision, I don't meditate and sit there for 20 minutes before I make a decision, but there is this automatic attempt to enter into a mindful state where you are existentially conscious of everything around you. And when you're existentially conscious of everything around you, the thing you're most conscious about is yourself. That the biggest gorilla sitting in the room is your own self. And if you're aware of that, you take yourself out of it. That to me is essentially the essence of mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, and the essence of mindfulness as an attribute to helping someone become a leader. That you take yourself out of the whole situation. I found that this resonated with my younger colleagues, all with, like I mentioned, the West Point College, because when I asked them to think of examples, they could then easily think of examples where they made difficult decisions and they had to take their own selves out of it. And when you ask them to train themselves to think every time in that mode of thinking, I found that it was a useful tool. Now, the second thing is, I mentioned earlier, the Western literature is always full of concepts about decisiveness, forcefulness, toughness, etc. as attributes of leadership, but very little about internal self-contemplation. And this style is not particularly relevant to a lot of younger Asian leaders who perhaps by nature are not that assertive. So at the same time, mindfulness as a concept, not so much from an academic approach, but perhaps from a more intuitive approach, is actually quite common and quite comfortable with many people who have grown up within a sort of Oriental philosophical tradition. So I found it very useful to relate to younger people when I talk to them about mindfulness, about taking the self out of the equation and looking at yourself with a certain amount of detachment and with a high degree of existential self-awareness. And the conundrum here, of course, is that the higher your level of self-awareness, the higher the ability to take yourself out of that equation. This I found quite useful because coming from the final direction of my interest in this is again my concern that not enough young people are aware, at least in my view, of what constitutes the fundamental attributes of leadership. I don't think it is just initiative, but more to do with a high degree of independent thinking, which is tied in also with the concept of mindfulness, and being very mindful of yourself. You are thinking for yourself, you're not just following other people. And that leads me to perhaps just a small little digression of an anecdote. I gave a talk, I think some years ago, to a primary school graduation where my youngest son was graduating from. And you have to remember that primary schools, they're about 12, 13-year-old kids, well, a little bit older, the secondary school. And they're all adolescent. So I asked, this was a mission school, so it's an all-boys school. So I asked them, what is the most liberating and the most dangerous three-letter word in the English language? The boys all said immediately, sex, right? The teachers, this was a mission school, said God. So they were kind of opposing each other. And I said the most liberating and the most dangerous three-letter word is the word why. And that has gotten me into all kinds of trouble because I've asked why, to teachers and told to stand in the back of the class. I've asked why to political leaders and gotten into other kinds of trouble. But I've always said that the essence of leadership is in the ability to ask why. And leadership is, again, not just manifested by a high degree of oratorical skills or by decisiveness, but it's manifested by the ability to think for yourself, so that whether it is a Galileo, who was clearly an intellectual leader, or Isaac Newton, or whether it's Nelson Mandela, who's clearly another form of leadership, it's the ability to ask the question why of the status quo, and deciding that the status quo ain't correct. And so whether you're a political leader, you're a religious leader, you are a thought leader of any kind, the ability to ask why, I think, is critically important to leadership. But that is also tied in with the concept of mindfulness. Unless you are aware that all the action, all the really important action that's going out there in the rest of the world isn't happening out there. It's actually happening in your mind. And it's what's happening in your mind that determines your ability to be a leader. I think once that thought gets through to a lot of younger people, a big sort of jump has been made. Finally, I'd just like to say that the idea of mindfulness is something that's actually very, very accepted, I think, in the East. I was just in Bangkok and reading a column in the Bangkok Post, written by some Thai person about business, whatever. And the headline was, "From mindless busyness to mindful business." So you can imagine, even in the popular media in Thailand and elsewhere, the whole concept of mindlessness, the whole concept of mindfulness is already part of everyday conversation. So in that sense, I think it's, I guess my last final comment is I would like to congratulate SMU for bringing into the academic realm something that probably has been amorphously floating around out there for the rest of us, giving it some kind of academic rigor and humor along the way. And I think it's also very good, speaking as an Asian, that concepts that have been rooted in Eastern philosophical traditions are perhaps making it to a mainstream. And that is perhaps the best thing that SMU also can do, that here in SMU we can create new forms of thinking, whether it be management thinking, new approaches to leadership, which then allows us to be innovative and unique at the same time. So thank you very much, and I'm mindful that my time is up. Thank you.
Just dropping by, I think you did quite mindful, talking about mindfulness, not so mindless as one expected. So I'm a previous academic myself, and I've read all the literature about mindfulness all the way back from Buddhism, including all the research literature. So I'm going to be very academic now. Is that okay? No. No, I'll just go down. Very basic. I'm really curious to hear, what is your own practice? I mean, you talk about very eloquently from a sense of practice. How do you practice?
I mean, as I said, I'm not a seriously practicing Buddhist, etc. Neither do I sit and contemplate my navel for 75 minutes a day. I think what I do, the most important point to me about mindfulness is the concept of self. And you know, in Buddhism, the concept of self is key to everything. And what I do now is that and this is really speaking from the heart, I've encountered in my life so many decisions, which when I try to grapple with it in a very rational way, you know, like you watch on television, somebody run a blackboard, pros and cons, and they sort of write all this out, it doesn't really get me very, very far. But when I try to be mindful, meaning I consciously sort of try to take myself out of it, and in a way, it's almost like when people say you should sleep on a decision. It's when you take your own self out of it, you find that the decision actually presents itself in a rather natural way. So what I do in my own life is, whenever I have to make a decision, that's quite difficult, I would weigh the pros and cons in every possible way, and then I so-called sleep on it, not by just going to bed and sleeping on it, but I sleep on it to the extent that I try to really take myself out of it in a semi-meditative way and see how the the solution arises. And more often than not, having made that decision and then looking back on it a few months later, I realized that it was a right decision because I didn't have to deal with myself, my ego, my emotions. When I say the self, it doesn't necessarily mean your own conceits, right? It means that if you have to let people go, it's yourself, it's your sense of emotions and everything else. So a high degree of compassionate dispassion, I think, is a detached compassion, which Buddhism talks about, is part of the whole concept of mindfulness.
Thank you. And I imagine you must be living a busy life, traveling a lot around, doing a lot of talks, doing a lot of work. How do you maintain this ability to actually stay, detached, stay egoless, stay mindful when you are busy? Do you have any best practice tips, like Lauren talked about this thing of taking 3 slow steps before entering the meeting? Do you have tips that you can share?
I take 4 slow steps. No, I think what is actually very useful is at certain moments, you choose those moments. You choose a certain particular moment to be intensely self-aware and to basically say to yourself, I'm looking down on myself with this detached third eye. I don't know how to explain it that easily, but it can be done. You sort of, sometimes you find yourself in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly think that, wow, I feel like I'm stoned. But you aren't. Not in Singapore. But those of you who have partaken but have not inhaled would realize that there are moments when you feel you are looking down on yourself, right? I mean, you haven't inhaled, but you have such experiences, right? So it's like those moments when you were all younger and less well-behaved and not in SMU. You have experienced moments of a certain kind of detached looking down on yourself. I think if you make that into a regular part of your life, at certain moments, you develop the ability to sometimes, again, look on yourself, look at yourself, and realize that there's very strong existential sense of self-awareness. And as I said earlier, I do believe very strongly that the more you are self-aware, the more you're also able then to take yourself out of it. The most difficult thing is for people to not be able to detach from their self. And when you cannot detach from yourself is always involved in your decisions, but you don't realize it.
Thank you. Did I get it right that you're suggesting that all your executive students, MBA students, should be smoking more hash? Or?
I don't ask my colleagues what substance they imbibe before they attend a leadership training session.
So a last question from me, and then I'll leave it to the audience, a serious one this time. Many business schools around the world, or at least some that we're working with, they are starting to implement mindfulness as a core component of their MBA studies. And you as the chairman of SMU, do you think that this is something that you will be looking at here? Because you're saying it is a critical skill for leaders.
I think, I've tried to read some of the literature on mindfulness, but I can't get past the footnotes. The footnotes are even more than the main article itself. So it's very intimidating. So therefore, I can't speak to the issue of academic research on mindfulness, etc. What I can say, though, because I am in the field of leadership development and training, that's something that I do in my own sphere and other spheres, is I do believe that there is a need, a very important need, to develop new paradigms of leadership training, management approaches, which do not just deal with the traditional Western, stereotypes of leadership attributes, as I mentioned, high degree of initiative, proactiveness, and so on. There is a need to develop new forms of leadership whereby the basis is rooted in internal contemplation. And to the extent that mindfulness, which I'm a little bit more familiar with in the Buddhist philosophical context and not so much in sort of mindfulness in the Western in management literature. I think it's very healthy that the Asian religious and philosophical traditions that deal with mindfulness and internal contemplation can be brought to the mainstream and integrated with other forms of leadership training so that we have a broader and a more holistic form of allowing people to access different ways by which they can think of leadership. So I think to that extent, and to the extent that I think SMU is located not just physically, but even intellectually, really at the crossroads of two most important, I guess, civilizations of the world, I think it is a great opportunity for SMU to identify not only mindfulness, but perhaps Asian philosophical traditions, and to see how that can be integrated into our own approach to leadership training.
Thank you. So, questions from the audience?
Hello. Hi, KP. I'm actually a pioneer of SMU, so I've been a huge fan of SMU 13 years ago. So happy with SMU. I came back for a Masters of Science and Innovation, and we even got very productive because I met my husband there, and now we have a 5-year-old daughter. So I'm really happy to actually be back here again and actually, I guess, engage in such conversations. What I'm actually interested in to ask you is around, you mentioned around how that we are very much influenced by Western traditions of their, I guess, context of leadership, that we need to actually increase more awareness, literary articles and things like that around how leadership in the Asian context and traditions could actually even empower more organizations. And I think this is what you've been trying to say. What I'm curious about is that what are some of your programs in Banyan Tree? Because you've mentioned you've got a Banyan Tree Management Academy. What are some of the programs that you think are relevant in providing such concepts of leadership from the Asian tradition that could actually be shared, if you could, for others to actually be more accessible to it? That's one. Another one as well is that in my journey of engaging leaders as well as learning about leadership, I've learned about the fact that we have leading self, leading others, and we have always been very focused on leading others, but it's also leading within and leading from the back, which is really about empowering and engaging others. So what are some of your thoughts around that? Because you mentioned third eye and looking from yourself, looking down at yourself and trying to disengage yourself. So what are your thoughts around those concepts, I guess? Thank you.
Well, obviously I can't share with you anything about Banyan Tree Management Academy technique because we'll have to patent it and we'll have to make it into a consultancy. Frankly, I don't think we have anything unique. Whatever we develop is purely a pragmatic response to our own situation. And our unique situation, I suppose, would be that we have a high degree of diversity. We only have about 12 to 13,000 colleagues or associates in the company, but we have about 55 nationalities. So that's one aspect of, one challenge of leadership development that we try to bridge, and also that we try to leverage off. That diversity is one source of leadership training. So we try to emphasize that diversity. We consciously try to make sure that when people come together in a batch for training, we form subgroups, of course, and we clearly want the subgroups to comprise of as many different people as possible, gender as well as in nationality. The second dilemma we have is that most of our people are quite young, being in the hotel industry, and at the same time not of the same intellectual background as people who would be going to Google, okay? But yet they have as much leadership potential as anyone else. It's just a different background, probably educationally of a lower level, but they have all the potential to be leaders. The dilemma is, how do you take such people and give them the confidence to be leaders in situations which in fact could be highly stressed, and more highly stressed than most of us go through in the hotel industry. So we develop ways to try to teach people that, and I don't think there's anything very specific I can impart to you, because I think every program has to be developed to be sort of relevant to the needs of a particular cohort of people. So that's it, I guess. The second thing about leadership itself, what are the attributes of leadership and so on. I found one of the things I did find at West Point, being a very American institution, and where I was coming from, is that at the end of the day, there's actually a lot of similarities. And I don't want to overemphasize the East-West divide. I only use the East-West divide in terms of the tools, the approaches to training, to the extent that we are each of us rooted in our own social cultural traditions. The tools for us may sometimes need to be different. But when you get down to it, fundamentally, whether you are in West Point, or you're at SMU, or you are in China, or anywhere else, I think people are now talking a lot about values-based leadership. And values-based leadership means going back to yourself. And as the West Point people say, the creed that you have is, a leader is not what you do, a leader is who you are. So you don't define yourself as a leader with a capital L. It's, if you live by your values, then you may well be a leader already, because certain circumstances will arise where you have to practice leadership. But you don't see yourself as a leader with a capital L. And that's, I think, fundamentally the same wherever you go. And mindfulness, I think, is probably just as relevant and to a Western world as to anyone else. It's just that the tools perhaps may be more rooted in an Asian tradition. But at the end of the day, we're all people, and I think to make this East-West divide too strong would be very unhealthy.
Thank you. And then I'm looking at the timekeeper and seeing that we're minus 2 minutes, so no more questions now. So I'd just like to thank you for dropping by and sharing your insights and experience.
Oh yeah, I got a very short question. Anyway, your Banyan Tree employees have very good respect for you. I was in Banyan Tree, Bangkok just last year. So my question is this: do you believe that the ability and opportunity to master mindfulness is a privilege?
What do you mean, a privilege?
To be able to master, because not everyone has the opportunity and also maybe even resources or maybe guidance to actually master mindfulness. So I just want to know whether you think it's more a privilege, or it's also, I mean, an extension to the question, should it be for all?
Yeah. I don't know how to answer, because is it a privilege? Yes, to the extent that it's a privilege for any of us to be able to be more, it's a privilege for any individual, any human being to be more aware of himself or herself. It's a privilege to be able to be a leader. It's a privilege to be all those things. But it's not a privilege in the sense that it is only accessible to certain people and not accessible to others. I don't think mindfulness and mindlessness is something that is predetermined by intelligence, by wealth, by race, by ethnicity, by anything else. But it is a privilege to the extent that you choose to be mindful, or you choose to live a life of very low self-cognition and very low cognition of life itself. That's for every individual to choose on their own accord.
Indeed, thank you.